the molecules actually responsible for doing this process. But later, much research since then has given us insight into actually how that process occurs, and we'll take a closer look at how that happens in just a second. So again, there's that famous equation up at the top for the photosynthetic pathway. The source of carbon dioxide for the plants is from the atmosphere, and it enters through the bottoms of leaves. So plants have leaves. They're large, broad organs for a reason, and that's to collect as much sunlight as they can. And the other function of them is to let in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you'll notice that if we were to break down the entire pathway and look at what is happening to each atom and each molecule, we'd see that it's actually the carbon and the carbon dioxide that's being converted into the sugar. So a sugar is a large ring of carbon molecules, and that has to come from somewhere, and that's the source of it. And this diagram on the bottom is us zooming in on the membranes where this process is occurring. So on the far left there, you see a chloroplast, and you see those stacks of membranes called thylakoid membranes. And inside the organelle, there is its own matrix, or stroma. It's kind of equivalent to like the cytoplasm of a cell. But this is occurring inside the chloroplast. If we were to zoom in on one of those pancake-looking things, we'd see that in it are molecules embedded right in the membrane. This is a phospholipid bilayer, just like the membrane of a cell is. This one, just like the cell membrane, has proteins embedded in it, and these proteins are responsible for converting sunlight into energy. What's important to note is that photosynthesis isn't the only reaction occurring inside the plant cells. It's not like plants do photosynthesis so they don't have to do other cycles like the citric acid cycle. That process is still occurring, and it's up here on the right. We can see the regular, this is the Calvin cycle. This is taking that carbon dioxide and turning it into sugar molecules on the right. And it takes energy to drive that reaction. And we can see our carbohydrates are being produced down here. So we know that energy is required for this process to happen. So where does that energy come from? It comes in the form of this ATP and NADPH molecule from the light reactions that are happening inside thylakoid membranes. So on the left we have light-dependent photosynthesis happening, where sunlight comes in, we're creating ATP and NADPH, then those molecules are shipped over to the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide is turned into carbohydrates. This is the overall picture of photosynthesis. It's the combination of those light and dark reactions. So let's take a look at the light-dependent reactions themselves. We have a series of proteins that are embedded in those thylakoid membranes inside the chloroplasts. And there's two proteins that I'd like to point out. One here called PS2, that just stands for photosystem 2, and this one called PS1, which stands for photosystem 1. There is no importance in the 2 and 1, just ignore those. It's just how they named them based on the order of their discovery. But we see that these two proteins are responsible for taking in that sunlight and using its energy to drive a reaction. That's why these are called light reaction centers. think it's a pretty cool name. But they're harvesting this light to excite electrons which are inside the proteins, which are moved to a second protein, then moved to a third protein, where they're excited by the sunlight again. And they're moved down this chain to eventually produce these ATP molecules in the upper right. You guys don't have to memorize this pathway, so don't panic. It's not important that you know each individual step here. But what is important to know is that sunlight is being used to drive the production of this ATP. And we'll notice that down here, water is being consumed in the production of oxygen. So that equation we looked at does balance. We can account for what's happening. So why do plants look green? And the answer is the chlorophyll pigment that is embedded in those light reaction centers absorbs every other wavelength of light, and green is transmitted. This is the nature of the light spectrum, and what we see as visible colors are the colors that are being transmitted and not absorbed. And plants, in their chloroplasts, those proteins, those light reaction centers, contain that molecule chlorophyll, which is absorbing yellow and red pigments, leaving the other ones to come out, and that's what we see as the green plant. Anybody want to take a guess at answer to this question? Did I hear E? Yep. What gave it away? Yeah. So, even though we've said that plants have chloroplasts, the truth is many other organisms also have chloroplasts. And cyanobacteria probably came about on Earth before plants did, and they were producing oxygen from the light, from the energy in the sunlight, before plants ever were. So many people believe that it's this group of organisms here, the cyanobacteria, that converted the carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere into oxygen on the ancient Earth, back when the atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide. And today we've benefited from that because us as animals require oxygen to live. So we've taken a look at the light-dependent reactions, and if you remember back to that picture I showed you, just to refresh your memory, I'll go back. On the right, we have the Calvin cycle, which is where the light-independent reactions occur. So once the sunlight produces our ATP and NADPH molecules on the left, they are shipped off to the Calvin cycle, and the sunlight is no longer needed. Those molecules now can do what they need to do to produce those carbohydrates, and we'll look at how that works with the light-independent photosynthesis. So we see carbon dioxide is incorporated into this cycle. What's actually happening is that carbon dioxide is being added to a chain of carbon molecules. It does require some bits of energy, and remember those came from the light-dependent reactions and the electron transport chain. And the final product was glucose. So we've invested some energy to produce this large molecule of glucose, which can be used to provide the cell later on down the road with even more energy. And what does that mean for the overall atmosphere and the overall chemistry of the Earth, and that's that plants can reduce greenhouse gases by pulling that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, as can algae and cyanobacteria. But what's important to take away from this is that an organism that does do photosynthesis can basically soak up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we know that carbon dioxide is one form of greenhouse gas which can trap heat from the sunlight. So that's what this diagram here is showing you. The sunlight is coming in and bouncing off because some heat escapes the atmosphere and goes back into space. Well, some of it will stay in the atmosphere on Earth. And the more greenhouse gases you have, the more intense this process is. So you can have lots of heat eventually trapped on Earth, and lots of people believe that it's this phenomenon that is contributing to the climate change that we are observing today. So here's a question that Dr. McCullough wanted you guys to think about. That's that abundances of carbon dioxide are the result of partly emissions from our activities, but also because we are removing plants from the biosphere and they can no longer act as those CO2 scrubbers, if you will. As a result, heat gets trapped on the surface and we have this greenhouse effect. And you can write down global warming if you want. Sometimes I just refer this to climate change because